Good evening and welcome to this conversation on racism and religion, presented by Blue Star Intercultural Centre and the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. I'm John Cleary, your host for this evening, and for much of my 30-year career with the ABC, I had the privilege of hosting a weekly Sunday night 4-hour discussion centred on topics such as the one before us tonight. So let me introduce to you our guests. Tasneem Chopra is a cross-cultural consultant named in 2019 by the Australian Human Rights Commissioner as an anti-racism champion. And as a writer and activist, Tasneem has featured on BBC World, Al Jazeera and the ABC's Q&A and The Drum. She's in demand as an advisor across the community and corporate sector to groups as diverse as Ambulance Victoria, the Australian Women's Centre for Human Rights and La Trobe University's School of Humanities. This year, 2020, her service was acknowledged with the receipt of the OAM, the Order of Australia Medal. Father Rod Bauer happily wears the epithet troublesome priest. He's well known around Australia for sticking his head above the trench at times of controversy. He's the Anglican rector at Gosford in the Diocese of Newcastle in New South Wales. He's also the author of the appropriately titled book, Outspoken. And in 2016, he was named Abyssinian of the Year by the Muslim community. The Venerable Jue Shi is director of the Humanistic Buddhism Centre and senior lecturer at Nan Tien Institute in Australia. Jue holds a PhD in religious studies, a Master of Arts in Buddhist studies, and also just happens to have a Master of Business Administration and a Master of Science in Computer Science and Engineering. Elhanan Miller is the rabbi of the ACT Jewish community. He's also a journalist and former Arab affairs correspondent for the Times of Israel, and he regularly comments on Israeli politics for Al Jazeera, the BBC, and Israel's public broadcaster, Khan. His opinion articles have appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. In 2016, he was the Richard Beeston Scholar at the Foreign Affairs Desk of the London Times. So, welcome to you all to the topic at hand. Wherever we look in global politics these days, we seem to see religion engaged in conflict with an ethnic dimension. Perhaps it shouldn't surprise us. Human beings, despite the views of certain schools of philosophy and economics, are not isolated individuals, but rather creatures of community. Historically, race and religion are shorthand markers of cultural identity. They tell us who we are. It's why they continue to have power for good and ill. We only have to look at the world of the 21st century. Religious ideology linked to ethnic and cultural identity is at the heart of today's conflicts in places as diverse as India, Burma, the Middle East, even amidst the Christians of Eastern Europe, and dare I suggest, in the current presidential election cycle in the United States. Questions of ethnic and cultural identity, often expressed in religious terms, infuse these issues. Religion has become a weapon in racialized culture wars. So, can we separate race or ethnicity from religion? Well, certainly in the minds of the founders of those great traditions, yes, but their followers have tended to express their faith in exclusive rather than universal terms. Now, I'm sure with such a topic as this, you'll have questions of your own to ask. So please make use of the YouTube chat bar to post your questions, and I'll do my best to pass them on to our panel. Perhaps the most current examples are both global and domestic. Nagorno-Karabakh is this week about cultural identity linked to ethnicity. And domestically, as I mentioned, in the United States, where both Republicans and Democrats feel free to deploy religious language to justify their arguments. So perhaps first to the United States. Father Rod Bauer, you've knocked around commentary on media for some years. What have been your thoughts on the global Black Lives Matter movement and the subsequent protests that have accompanied it? I mean, particularly when you hear interviews with people on both sides stating with great conviction that the Lord is on their side.
We all like to think that, I guess, to some point. But I mean, you've got a whole group of people in the United States crying out, don't shoot, my life matters. But you have a whole society that is degrading itself in all kinds of ways. It's like it's almost like the end of an empire. It's that cycle where you start to get a society that upholds celebrities of all kinds and even makes them into presidents. And when you get that sort of thing happening in society, you get a deep sense of insecurity, especially within the domination system, which is that sort of white, male, heterosexual, Christian domination system. And that they start to see the other that aren't part of that system as the enemy. And so you get law enforcement agents caught up in this whole insecurity. Well, they'll start to, as we've seen, shoot people of African-American people or people that are different, treat them in appalling ways. And so you get that group of people saying our lives matter. And when they're not listened to, Dr. King, of course, said that, riot is the language of the unheard. And so you get people crying out in all kinds of ways, you need to hear us. We're hurting, we're in pain. And as I guess, from my Christian tradition, of course, it pains me deeply that people who claim that tradition are in no way following its founder, who spoke about this idea of this kingdom that was a just society where people weren't oppressed or marginalised. It grieves me deeply to see people claiming to be Christian yet behaving in a way that is the antithesis to that.
Tasneem, you're also a keen consumer of media. How have you looked at the way Black Lives Matter has arisen in the United States and calls on deeply felt religious traditions to justify where they are? And Rod, you've mentioned Martin Luther King, but also equally on the Republican side, you hear conservative Christians identifying the white cultural identity, albeit implicitly, of Donald Trump and owning it as a religious force, the deployment of religion on both sides.
Well, I think it's what you just mentioned in the introduction there, John. It's how faith has been weaponized to serve an end goal. And I think to the extent that the right-wing Christian movement in the US has weaponized Christianity as if it were a pathway and justification, and in fact that their supreme leader was in fact the embodiment of all that is supremely Christian values. But when they're actually then asked to, can you reconcile then this holy man's view with the treatment of so-called illegals, with the children in cages, or with his previous marital shall we say transgressions, for example, they don't have an answer for that. They don't have an answer for that. They're like, well, no, this is bigger than that. This is bigger than that. And so this inability to be able to address the shortcomings with their ideology, to me, indicates that it's not a faith-driven, it's not a genuine. Well, this is my perception. It's not a solid faith-driven agenda. It's very much about power. It's very much about the need to have and to control and to assert one's right and entitlement, and believing that if you say it's in the name of God, then it's okay. The fact that there are numerous things happening which are really counter-Christian is a side issue, is a distraction, is a function of fake news and the opposition. I think it shows a massive flaw in the integrity of their argument.
Elhanan, you might have some observations on the situations in the United States, but of course, historically, one only has to look at the impact of the 1930s and the cultural disruption of the 1930s to see the way the power of religion deployed as a racial weapon can be used to decimate entire communities. So do you think people are aware, or have they forgotten too easily the lessons of just 2 generations ago when it comes to the way religion is being deployed these days?
Well, I think it's a bit blurry. I think you're right. Religion has been weaponized. I really agree with that observation. I think, though, the large racial racist movements of the 30s and 40s that you mentioned weren't necessarily religious movements. They were, they may have sometimes used religion in a utilitarian way, but I really believe that racism is a global condition. It's a human condition, and religion can be weaponized because it's such a potent tool, and it can be abused by people who speak on behalf of religion. Yes, I fear that people did forget the lessons back then, and we see terrible examples today. You've mentioned Black Lives Matter. We've seen cases elsewhere in the world of, racial and, genocides and attacks against communities. I think it's our responsibility as educators and as leaders of faith to try to combat that with our tools. But I'm under no illusion that religion is the key to all the racial, problems in the world. I think it has to be a global effort from both religious and secular movements, not just from religious people.
Venerable Juwei, you're one of those who has given your life as a Buddhist in seeking the interior life to be able to express itself in well-lived lives. Yet the Buddhist tradition of which you are a part has itself been caught up in these things. One has to look at Myanmar and the tension with the Rohingya and the citizens of Myanmar. One can look at other countries and see similar things. Well, we could talk about the Hindu community too and what's happened in India. That religion, is it because religion is so deeply identified with culture? That is, the local culture and its religious traditions emerge together and build civilizations.
Well, thank you very much, John. You are right. I'm only an ordinary Buddhist nun. I don't know very much about politics. But when I look at the world around me and looking at all the suffering that's taking place, it helps me to solidify and confirm the teachings of the Buddha, where the first noble truth says that there is suffering in this world and things are just imperfect. It also helps me to appreciate my master, Venerable Master Sheng Yun, the founder of Nantian, who says that the world is halves and halves. So we can look at this half of the world whereby religion is weaponized, or we can look at the other half where there are many others who are working for peace. In thinking about the Black Lives Matter, which started this conversation, I think of two leaders, Dr. Martin Luther King, that was alluded to earlier, and Thich Nhat Hanh. They both shared a passion for non-violent, peaceful liberation of all people. So I really see things as being two sides of a coin. Appreciate peace because of all the unfortunate circumstances that are happening around us. And certainly religion is a part of culture, but culture has two sides. And I would like to see religion as the means for bringing out the best of humanity too.
Well, it's an interesting point you make there, and I'd like to get anyone to comment on this, that the link with religion and culture is that culture is often expressed as the particular. Religion is expressed as the general, or the ideals of religion as expressed as a general. When we want world peace, all religions want world peace. Yet when it comes to cultural identity, religion is used as a signature of cultural identity. If you change that, you change our culture. And you even see it, well, in Western societies, we were still arguing between Protestants and Catholics up till 20 years ago. Some people are still arguing it. In other cultures, religion is such a particular personal marker that it seems at odds. It almost seems as though there is a paradox, that the great religions are civilizational, are broad in saying there are universals that we all should share. Yet when it comes to personal identity, the power of religion is with the particular. Tasneem. Or anyone else who wants to throw in. It just seems to me that they're the two powers we're dealing with.
I look at it this way. So within all the major faiths, okay, and major belief systems, there is these dichotomies of right and wrong, of heaven and hell, of good and bad. If you're a Muslim, there's halal, there's haram. There are certain prohibitions and things that are accepted. So there's this religiously sanctioned dichotomy that exists within faiths that are there to guide us and to give us some direction, if you like. But then as humans, and pertinent to the human condition, what happens is, this is me in analysing how racism occurs, is that somehow that dichotomy sort of manifests to cultural expressions of colour, of language, of traditions that occur within either within your community or that you project onto others. And then you start making distinctions because your faith also engenders certain dichotomies. But in fact, and I think this is what Venerable Jue speaks to, is that if we applied the apparatus of our faith, which is to enjoin an ethical approach to engaging with others, we wouldn't make distinctions on colour, on language, on tradition, because we would understand and we would value that as part of a humanity that is all-encompassing. But instead, we go in with this idea of, well, there has to be one and there has to be another. It has to be black and white, right? When in fact it doesn't. So it's almost like it's a test. It's a test for us. We know what is the right thing to do, but we don't always manifest that because our autopilot is to make distinctions, where in fact that's a test to see, are you going to make those dichotomies of good and bad based on visual cues, when in fact the right thing is to act in an ethical way. So I'm not sure if I got that point across.
No. Yeah.
But it's an observation perhaps that it's the what's the word, the aftermath of having a dichotomous view within religion.
Yes, Rod.
I guess there's certain stages of faith development that have come with certain dynamics, and Tasneen is identifying that kind of that structural stage of faith development that actually dominates all kinds of institutional religion or organised religion. It's that structural stage. It's the best business model for a church or a mosque or a temple. It keeps people in the boundaries. But
yes,
and while it's not racist in itself, it actually does promote a mindset that can lead to racist behaviour, because it is dualistic and it is binary. It is about who's in and who's out. Who's a heretic and who's orthodox and all that kind of stuff. So that mindset, once you're in that structural binary kind of mindset, you set yourself up to otherize. Now, whether it's the Catholic otherizing the Protestant or vice versa, or one faith against another, it's the same kind of dynamic. And so once you've set yourself in that mindset, you will see someone of a different ethnic origin in that same dynamic, and religion is so good at that because it does function mostly in that structural stage until you get kind of beyond that and you get into the mystics and all sorts of other wonderful things. But yeah, so we're a bit of a sitting duck for that kind of behaviour.
Yes, I suppose it's because up until, say, 150 years ago, religions were mostly associated with cultural and ethnic traditions, specific ones. So, the glorious British Empire was European Christianity. The China was the land of other in religion, and India was Hindu. So there was up until 150 years ago, these dichotomies were clear and absolute. We're now entering a multicultural world in which those things rub up against each other. They can't live separately. They have to live together. And that surely is part of the real challenge facing religious traditions. The Jewish community seemed to have done it rather well for the best part of a couple of thousand years until the 1930s. But Elhanan Miller, that discussion must have gone on within Jewish tradition a lot around the world over the last few hundred years.
Right.
How to live with the other.
Yes, and it developed unevenly depending on where the communities were. European Judaism went through rapid secularization at the end of the 18th and during the 19th centuries, whereas communities in North Africa and the Middle East and the subcontinent and Asia stayed much more traditional, even maintaining such practices as polygamy into the 20th century. So it's been uneven. Another cataclysmic change, of course, was the establishment of Israel in the mid-20th century in 1948, which brought all these very, very different communities in one country. Today, about half of the Jewish population of the world lives in Israel. Almost the same number live in the United States, and the rest is very small. So it's very much a bipolar Jewish world today. And today, the two sort of polar poles here deal with communitarianism and with, I guess, treating the other in very different ways, because the Jewish community in the United States is part of a multicultural society, living as a minority, quite a successful, well-integrated minority in the United States. Whereas in Israel, Jews are the ones who have to determine the state functions and live as a majority. So it's been a very, very different way. So in Israel, the challenge is how to govern over a minority that is not Jewish, and how do we treat, the Arab Palestinian minority in Israel. Whereas in the United States, it's how to fit in and maybe preserve cultural and religious identity in a broader culture that's actually accepting to multiculturalism, and how to maintain your uniqueness within the United States. So very different challenges.
You've also had challenges with immigrant Jewish communities into Israel, and that's fallen along racial lines more than once. One can think of African communities coming in.
Right. I mean, we don't generally think of the Ethiopians. I think that's who you're referring to as a separate race necessarily, but definitely a different cultural group, a different maybe ethnic group in some ways. It wasn't just the Ethiopians, although that's maybe the most recent example because they arrived in the 90s for the most part. But, in the 50s and 60s, it was Moroccans, Moroccan Jews, and Romanian Jews were discriminated against, and Russians to some extent in the early 90s as well. Racism is, I think, a problem that every immigrant society deals with. And even though Israel is a very, very unique example of an immigrant society, because everyone does share that Jewish background, racism is, of course, a big issue in Israel as well. And it's something that we have to struggle with and that we're trying to tackle.
Do you think there is something, perhaps a hangover too? And Jue, I might get you to comment on this, but I'll bring you in a little later on this. Just one tag question that links on to what Elhanan is observing. Is there something in this about the imperial hangovers from the West, particularly whether it's America today or Britain, whatever, that there are civilizational issues here which stem back into religious traditions? I'll give you an example. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, coming out of World War II. Early in the 1990s, we had an example of leaders in Asia, particularly I think it was Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, questioning whether the whole concept of human rights wasn't a Western values concept, and if there were not Asian values that should be considered, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights shouldn't be considered universal, that it wasn't a universal. Now, this was explained by some commentators as simple individualism versus communitarianism with religious undertones. Others saw it as a cynical political attack on liberty and civil rights. Leaving aside Lee Kuan Yew's motives, that argument held sway for a good few years. Tasneem, let me get your observation first, and then I'll go to Jue on this.
Yeah, look, I wasn't across that particular interpretation of the declaration, but I would say to the issue of, are some communities, some communities, religious communities are prone to a colonial hangover in the way that they racialize internally. So I mean, obviously we've just heard from Elhanan about the experience of minorities in an immigrant context, and certainly within Islam there is definitively, racialized practices that favor one community over another when it comes to perceptions of others. So that is there, and I would say to a large extent when those occur within communities that were previously colonized, from Southeast Asia, for example, or even parts of East Africa, then I would say, yes, there is some sort of legacy that bleeds into religions, even though it's a culturally driven issue.
Mm. Xu Wei, I just interested in your observation about Lee Kuan Yew's opposite, that you've got to, look, take him, let me take him at his word, that he was saying, look, you don't understand. We come out of a different cultural tradition. We see things differently. Don't try and apply that set of values to a different set of circumstances.
Well, I have to agree. Well, first, even in Buddhism, human rights has been a difficult issue for us, this concept of rights, because in Buddhism, in our tradition, it's mainly about your duties, your responsibilities, rather than thou shalt have this right. So the idea of human rights is truly, I think, a Western concept that Buddhism is now getting to appreciate and embrace. Because in Buddhism, we do believe in equality, that all of us, by virtue of being human, have a certain nature, which we call the Buddha nature, and that is equal. So you and I are basically equal on that ground. And because of the virtue of that equality, I treat you with respect and you will treat me with respect. Now, what Tasnim mentioned earlier about non-duality comes from this as well. There is non-duality in this intrinsic nature. Unfortunately, in our everyday engagement with worldly affairs, we take on this division. We see a segregated self. And with the recent development in science and technology, we become more and more powerful. So we take on individualism. And with this segregated self, I think we become more protective of so-called rights. And so the whole rights movement came to the fore. In Buddhism, already in Chinese, there's these two characters called kai xin, open the heart, and that means happiness. I think all of us want happiness. In the pursuit of happiness, we want to open the heart to embrace as many people as possible. I think it's from that principle that we wish to operate, as opposed to saying, here are my rights, you must give me my rights.
Rod Bauer, have you got a comment on that, that distinction that's being drawn and the usefulness of the sort of heavy-handed individualism that we've seen in the West over the last 50 years?
Oh, yes, I totally resonate with what Joy has said. It's that increase in the consciousness. When your consciousness increases in terms of individualism, you don't have any choice but to start to see the other as other. And the minute you do that, you lose that sense of connection, of intimacy, and you lose that sense of what harms that person also harms me. And we start to just think in terms of just what's it about for us. So I totally understand that. I mean, I think what Buddhism has, I mean, I guess all the great world religions are founded by mystics. And I think what Western Christianity has sadly done is moved away from that foundation. Whereas I think in Buddhism, I mean, I generalize here, I suppose, a little bit, but Buddhism has been less inclined to move away from the mystic foundations, whereas Christianity, I think, sadly has, and which in the West, of course, has increased that sense of individualism.
Well, we talked about the particularities that religious traditions have all used to actually help develop distinct cultures generally. Let's talk for a moment now about those universal principles behind the great religious traditions, whether we talk about the Buddha or the words of Jesus in the Christian tradition, or Muhammad, there seems to be a universal sense in what they're saying. And it's not about universal law applied to a whole group of people. It's attitudinal, as Yue has so articulately expressed. Let's touch on it. Perhaps, Elhanan, we touch on first the Jewish tradition. And what are the sort of great principles which would undergird religion being a bridge rather than a barrier?
Yeah, well, it is a bit, I guess, intricate, because Judaism is a religion that's always defined itself along a peoplehood, a nation.
Yes.
But given that, there still are very strong universalist traditions within Judaism. First of all, the prophetic traditions, which always spoke in terms of all of humanity and called on a universal idea of justice. Interestingly, right now we're in the midst of a festival in Judaism called Sukkot, or Tabernacles, which is actually seen as one of the most universal festivals, because the sacrifices that used to be sacrificed in the temple during the time when the temple still existed in Jerusalem, there were 70 bulls throughout the 7 days of Tabernacles that were supposed to symbolize the 70 nations of the world. And in the prophetic traditions, for example, in the books of Zechariah, and Isaiah, etc., we're talking about nations that come, to the center in Jerusalem and worship that one God. So certainly around these pilgrimage festivals, these biblical pilgrimage festivals, there is a universal note. Religions, let me just add one last comment. Religions are a mixed bag. All of our religions here have developed over many, many centuries, and they carry both particularistic and universalistic trends in them. And I think it's our responsibility as educators and as people of faith and clerics to highlight those universalistic trends and try to emphasize them, because they exist. So it's more about how we educate our communities and our adherents to realize those texts and sort of realize them and appreciate them for what they are, because there's plenty of people highlighting the negative or the ones that divide us. So if I speak about Sukkot, I would like to sort of highlight these universalistic, uniting messages.
Rod Bauer, what are the great universal principles or universalizing principles in Christianity which would take us away from the particularisms of protecting identity?
I guess, and this is not just Christian, of course, but to love your neighbour as yourself, and we get the golden rule, I guess, across all the great faiths. It was the big question, one of the big arguments in Jesus's day was, I guess, two rabbinic. I'm treading on Elhanan's ground here, but the traditions of everyone agreed what this first great commandment was, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. But the trouble came with the second. What was it to love your neighbour as yourself, as we get echoed in the New Testament, or was it to be holy, to keep yourself, pure and undefiled? And of course, that's the argument that's going on when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. He's engaging in this dynamic, this argument, and I think this argument plays itself out again and again and again. Do we love our neighbours as ourselves, or do we keep ourselves pure and undefiled? And that plays itself out in the racism argument. It plays itself, the refugee argument is a classic example of that dynamic over again. Do we love these poor people floating around on boats out, or do we keep ourselves pure? Now, I guess, the founder of the firm that I work for was very clearly on the side of your love for neighbour is more important than your own particular doctrinal framework or your own particular ethnic purity, or and I guess you will find that and again, it depends on the stage of the faith development of the individual and of the community. where they will come down in that space. If they're in the structural stage, they're going to be much more likely to want to hold up the doctrinal or racial or whatever purity, how they see it, rather than sort of break down that fence and build the bridge to loving the neighbour as yourself. But I think if we get back to the pure foundation of the great prophets and Buddhas and Christs that we follow, then you'll find at the core of that that to love the other is a core element.
Tasneem, in your dealings with multi-faith groups and multicultural groups, do you find people are willing to talk and use their religious language to talk about building bridges and to actively pursue their religion in that way?
Look, I do. I think when the intention is to bring together people of different faiths to the table to have a conversation, that I think there's both a willingness to listen, but also a willingness to share it as well.
Right.
And so I think there's a great argument to be made of both reciprocity and not tolerance, because I hate that word, but I think understanding. And so I think with understanding and with reciprocity at the table, you can actually learn more, both from others, but also have that opportunity to have your faith understood and learned, because people are at the table to learn and not just, there's a line from a song that I love that says, it's hard to listen while you preach. And I think so much of that, I think, comes back to the way that we need to be really well-intended with why we're at the table. Are we just there to get our point across? And this is beyond religion. This is everything. This is politics. I mean, are we just there to be heard, or are we there to affect change? And affect change it requires, it's a two-way conversation. That's the only way it's actually going to be heard. But just based on, the responses both Al-Hanan gave and Rod gave, even within Islam, when you talk about what are those zeitgeists within your religious culture that actually speak to universality and brotherhood or community. And I think within Islam, I'm not a scholar, but there are two famous key verses and scriptures. One is in the Hadith, which is what the Prophet, peace be upon him, would have said in his last sermon, where he basically made a call unto the entire community. And he said that all mankind, this is an excerpt from the last sermon that he gave before he died. And he said, all mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over an Arab, nor does a non-Arab have any superiority over an Arab. A white has no superiority over a black, nor does a black have any superiority over a white. None have superiority over another except by piety and good action. So that's a pretty black and white endorsement of the fact that everything should not be black and white. And the second is an actual ayah or a passage in the Quran that says, and I'll just read that out to you, and that was an injunction that, we have made you from nations and tribes so that you may get to know one another. So within that particular ayah or the word of God is that acknowledgement that there is diversity built into the DNA of humankind. But the purpose of that is so that we learn, is that we sit at the table, is that we reciprocate, and that we listen and exchange.
There seems to be a great challenge here, and I'll get each of you to comment on this. And Zhu Wei, we might start with you, because I think perhaps in Buddhism there's a broader tradition here that the way to cultivate believers is to instruct them at the heart of the faith, and that has a certain exclusivism about it, a certain, we have the truth. And then getting beyond that, you move to, this is a truth we need to share. And getting beyond that again, this is something that we actually share mutually with others. Now, having made that description, I'll give you one other observation. Stephen Prothero of Boston University, the professor of religion at Boston, wrote a book a few years ago where he took up one of the interesting challenges that people in multi-faith discussions often have. They say, oh, we're all on different paths up the same mountain. And Prothero said, no, we are not. We may be on similar paths up different mountains, but we have to recognize that ultimately we may have different ends. That doesn't mean we don't share an enormous number of things in common, but we're too naive in the way we start approaching these issues. I just get a general response on that. Zhuwei, from you first, and then perhaps from others.
Yeah, I think it's this definition of truth, right, that we're getting at. So whose truth and which is true among the truths? I would say that in Buddhism, we say that truth is not defined by any one person. It is defined by what can transcend time and space. So anything that remains true across the ages, anything that can be seen as true across different countries, across different time zones, that's truth. So in Buddhism, the truth is called impermanence. I think unless it can be proven otherwise, that's what we see as truth. What's considered truth is the non-self, so that we are all interdependent in that sense. So unless that can be proven otherwise. And I think in Buddhism, we are pretty open to the fact that if something we say is not true and is proven otherwise, we'll just amend our rules accordingly. So in a way, we are quite adaptable. But I think everything is based on respect. I think respect for others doesn't mean that whatever other people say, just because it doesn't match with us, is not true, because we all come from different perspectives. I think one of the parables we have are the many different blind men trying to figure out what an elephant is. So a blind man at the tail will say, an elephant is like a rope. Somebody will say, touching the ear and say, oh, an elephant is like a fan. So we're just looking at different aspects. And depending on where we are, this is what we see as truth. Nobody is right. Nobody is absolutely right. Nobody's absolutely wrong. It's all relativism.
There are some key questions here that work their way through into each of our political cultures, particularly these days in Western societies, where religions are rubbing up against each other in ways which people at the local community level are learning to accept that somebody else's truth may not be quite the same as theirs, but there's enough in common to be dealing with. That opens us up to the way in which we engage with multi-faith communities today, and particularly multi-faith communities that have strong ethnic identities attached to them, to race. It's an intra-community question first, and then an inter-community question second. How do we deal? And let me go for a sort of reasonably practical example. Local communities rub up against each other. The Muslim community in Auburn may invite the local Christian community to share a meal. That's one thing. But if you extend that to, say, a Somali community in Melbourne and a non-Somali, a European community in Melbourne, it's clear that in the last 10 years, people have wanted to exploit differences there. So there are real differences emerging in Australia which can work in a positive way or can work in a negative way. Is Australia robust enough at the practical level to take religion, the religious dimension of these tensions, seriously? And Rod, you've probably had experience on the ground of this, that you can have even shared faith traditions which ethnically clash at the ground level. And are we robust enough and politically astute enough to deal with that? Or have we done what some other cultures do, and sort of we pretend that religious issues don't exist behind some of these political issues, and in doing so, we ignore what are substantial issues that could, substantial ways of resolving some of those issues? I've taken a long way to get to that question, but I think you know where I'm going.
Yeah, I mean, I guess going back to the idea of truth, and again, I'll be critical of Western Christianity in this way. We see truth as a propositional kind of thing, and echoing Shui, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, always spoke about provisional truths. I have provisional truths. There may be a day when I see something new and different that challenges. But for Christianity, again, in its purest form, truth is not a propositional thing. It's not a doctrinal thing. It's not about what truth is seen in a person. St. John has Jesus say, "I am the way and the truth." Now, that text has been used and abused to exclude and do all sorts of terrible things. But the core of that idea is that truth is found in all of us. We are the truth. Standing, naked in the world, that is truth. And every time we open our mouths, we probably move a little away from that truth. and so I guess I want to use that to get to your question, John, is that what I've discovered is the best interfaith relationships begin with two human beings from different traditions who put aside their propositional, their doctrines and their provisional truths, and understand that as a human being, that is my truth. And you are a human being that stands before me in your truth. That's where we meet. And when we are really open and honest and truthful in our being, we can bring our communities then together. But it is absolutely essential that there are two community leaders willing to own their human truth first, and others will see the truth of that, and they will come together.
And that truth transcends. What's a very interesting example, I think, of all of this is perhaps what we saw 30 years ago in South Africa, the way in which religious faith, Muslim and Christian, which had been seen for 100 years as a barrier between race, actually became the bridge. I mean, it was people like Tutu and others reaching out across divides that were faith-based divides and saying, no, religion is a bridge here. And I think it came through your observation there, Rod, that what they saw first was the common humanity. And then if you fit the religious puzzle around that, you build a bridge, not a barrier. But it's picking up the elements. Zhu Wei, is that the way you see these things? Because there must be doctrinal traditions in Buddhism as well.
Yes, there are doctrinal, in fact, sometimes even divisions among the different schools of Buddhism. But nevertheless, I agree with Rod. I think it is about the human condition. What is this truth anyway? It's about the human condition, how we exist, how we deal with the world. And yes, and that's why compassion is, I think, so key among all the faith traditions. Compassion, suffering with, in this human condition that we are together in. In Buddhism, we have what we call the treasury of the words of the Buddha, or the treasury of truth, Dhammapada. And in that, there's one saying that says, hatred is never appeased by more hatred. It is love that conquers hatred. This is an eternal law. And where does that come from? Where does that love come from? I believe it's from what Rod has said, using religion as that bridge to see that common humanity, so we can love one another.
Elhanan, that can be said of Judaism too.
Yeah, yes. And I think, I, as you can hear from my accent, I'm not Australian, and I've only been here in Australia for 7 months. So if you'll allow me, I'd like to focus on the context that I come from, which is Israel. And in the context of the peace process, I feel like one of the reasons why it's failed so far is because religious language wasn't inserted enough into the process. Yes. It was a process that was constructed and conducted by mostly secularized elites, and they left the religious actors on both sides on the sidelines. Now, there were good reasons for it. They were the obstructors, they were sort of the troublemakers. But I think today there's more and more understanding where I come from that you can't exclude religious actors because religion is such an important part of people's identity and part of the conflict. So today there's more and more voices of people on both sides of the divide who come from religious backgrounds, are believers. And I myself have been involved in quite a few of these initiatives back home. And I'm involved today in a project to educate Muslims and Arabs specifically about Judaism. And I think a very, very basic element in peace building is understanding the religious and cultural background of the other side. It's absolutely key. And I'd say that the same thing is probably true in multicultural societies like Australia, even secularized societies like Australia and other Western societies. In order to understand where, especially I'd assume minorities and immigrants come from, and to better integrate them, there has to be at least an understanding of their religious language, their cultural background, what religion even means. And I'm very glad to say that even here in Canberra, where I'm serving right now, schools that probably have very few Jews in them are inviting me to speak about ritual and practice. So I think it's very important for people to understand even the concept of religion.
Tasneem, let me ask you about the circumstances that exist in some parts of the world. Like you take France, for instance, on this issue of the way religion gets integrated into the conversation. The Muslim community in France has seen some terrible events over the last 10 or 15 years. Some people say the problem there is the French government's attitude to the way religion is inserted in the conversation. Laïcité means that it's not. It's not part of the conversation. It's not recognized as being relevant. And in some ways, this is part of the reasons why you have such tension within those communities. Your observation on that?
I would agree. And it's, some people will say, oh, well, they're a voiceless minority, and they're not voiceless, they're deliberately silenced. I mean, isn't that the adage? You're either deliberately silenced or ignored for a greater cause. And going back to the essence of what we've just been speaking to, we talk about truth and engagement. And I think at the grassroots level, whether it's France or whether it's the US or whether it's whether it's Australia, we do. If you look at the microcosm of suburban towns and interfaith engagement that's occurring at the grassroots level, it's healthy, it's robust, and it does work. And we see it happen. I think each one of us here, to some extent, through the work practice that we have, we are making those interactions. But where things go wrong is when institutions use the faith to leverage difference. And when I talk about institutions, I speak to media and I speak to government, because that's what I'm going to do, who will actually use that as a pinpoint to drive division. And we only had to look at the way, for example, the way that COVID cases were in Melbourne, for example. I think it was during stage 1 where there were some certain families that were, presumably of Muslim background, who apparently were having these gatherings and dinners post-Ramadan, and they were the cause and they were the trigger. And it's like interesting the way that was racialized as a trigger to then come to understand the crisis that we're living in. Yet when just this weekend, in beachside Melbourne, there were clusters of people gathering without masks, breaking social distancing, but those particular people didn't fit a profile that was of a racial minority. It was never addressed in those terms. It was never they were never denigrated in the way that other communities were. So you're battling this sort of this beast that is institutions who are trying to corral difference based on religion because it suits them. It's politically expedient. It sells newspapers, and that furthering of division, it goes towards keeping people in their lane. And it's very, the US does it, textbook, Australia does it as well, and France definitely does it. So grassroots, we know it works and we see it thrive, but the limitations posed on, can Australia be robust enough to do well as a country and enjoying greater conversation and greater interfaith success? I feel like we hit a wall when we move beyond anything that's grassroots, to be honest.
Yes, secularisation in the West has tended to marginalise religion. In Australia, it's something of an embarrassment. In France, you exclude it. In Australia, it's just embarrassing. In some ways, it can lead to a problem, though, because Australian politicians will recognise religion if they're going to hand out the odd grant somewhere. But in general, in politics, it's said, no, we don't do religion, much as Tony Blair's political advisor, said to Tony Blair. And in that loss of religion having a legitimate place in the conversation, something is lost for all of us. Can I turn finally to that question of religion and its relationship to race in Australia and the way we have dealt with our own Indigenous communities over the years? Rod Bauer, I'll turn to you first as an Australian and just give me a few observations, because we've got one or two questions here, but they've focused around similar issues. That is, they're one on secularisation we've already dealt with, and the other one on the way slavery has been part of religious traditions. They actually sort of dehumanise different groups and have enslaved them. Australia has had a shocking history with our own Aboriginal community and with Islander communities through Kanaka labour in the 19th century and early 20th century. Where are we along that path now? We certainly mouth the words at Parliament. People recognise, I think our Josh Frydenberg today acknowledged the people of the country, but have we really progressed?
Nowhere near as far as we ought to. And talk about slavery. I mean, we still can't pass a slavery bill in our Parliament, and it's been watered down. And so we still have that idea that we can commodify other human beings or turn them into something that is useful to us, and
or infantilise them even.
Or infantilise. I mean, again, it's that structural issue. If we, our early Christian missionaries here in Australia. You couldn't make Aboriginals white and European, so we dressed them up. Indigenous people, we dressed them up as nice Englishmen, and again, it's just a denial of culture, a denial of a total identity, and until we learn to not just sort of otherize, but recognise the other as an entity in their own, with their own identity and culture and hopes and dreams and religion, and be secure enough in ourselves, no matter what tradition we come from, to encourage the celebration of that. Not to deny it. I don't think we should deny race or religion. We should be confident enough in our own identity to be able to join in the other and enable the other to celebrate who they are in their own culture, their own religion, their own identity, because I think that's a healthy future for Australia.
For somebody who's come from a non-Anglo-Australian tradition, Zhu Wei, how have you seen Australia's dealing with its own Indigenous community and in fact, the way in which race has been an issue? Has it been evident to you?
Yes, it has been. Since I arrived here about 8 years ago, I've been with some Indigenous communities around my area as well, and they have told me stories, but they've also been given some room to build their own botanical gardens, for example. So I'm happy to see changes taking place. Now, John, you mentioned that Australia is now a secularized society. I've read that it is now a post-secularized society, in the sense that spirituality is coming back, especially among the younger generation Z. And that's very positive. I see that Indigenous communities, the multicultural communities that are here in Australia, we can co-create our future. And it's looking towards that possibility with the younger generation, with people who have been disadvantaged in the past, but not to hold grudges in any ways, but to look forward. And together, I think that we can build a very strong and cohesive Australia if we want to. But now it's that attitude and that intention, and that will change that field. So I hope that, all the communities can come together. And conversations like this, I believe, is so helpful.
Well, Hanan, you're a recent arrival, as you've said. Coming to Australia, how have you seen this country in terms of your limited reflections, but also before you arrived? And has your understanding changed?
Well, one thing that I was very surprised and actually moved by was acknowledgement of the original custodians of different parts of the country that are said in public gatherings. I find that extremely significant to recognize that there were, indigenous people here and that the land was shared by other people as well before, before the white, I guess, migration or settlement, whatever happened. That's something that I still find very moving. And the fact that there's a robust debate about how to address past grievances as well. All of our religions, as I said before, are a mixed bag or a bag of hundreds of centuries of development. Slavery was part of, obviously, Jewish history as well. The Bible talks about slaves. Jewish law, in the Middle Ages talks about owning slaves. And as modern people, we have to acknowledge the fact that, things that today we consider immoral and abhorrent existed in our religions in the past. Face those realities, with honesty and try to figure out how to address them today, what slavery means today, why slavery was abhorrent and why it doesn't exist anymore and why we should fight it in all its forms. And maybe understand how we can fight these modern forms of servitude and slavery, for example, to gigantic corporations, or even, now they're talking in the context of social media about how much control people have, these corporations have on people's lives, and kind of exploitation that takes place without us even knowing it, and try to allow the maximum, amount of human liberty and human freedom in the modern context of what it means to be free and have free choice.
Tasneem, we've got to wrap things up, but we've seen the way the Muslim community has begun to integrate into Australia. And I think in a positive way that the awkwardness and the difficulties of the first few years of, particularly over the last 20 years, have begun to give way to a sort of more nuanced understanding. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the way Australia is addressing these sort of foundational issues?
Oh, look, I'm optimistic, and I would preface that with the knowledge that, in fact, Muslims have been in this country prior to white settlement. So we have actually been here from the late 1600s, and that is a fact that a lot of Muslims themselves don't even acknowledge. But I think when you understand that, our presence here is long. In recent history, though, the experience of newer migratory communities has, been on the backdrop of a very, I guess it's a very controversial geopolitical climate as well. So there's been all those associated experiences of marginalization, racism, war on terror. There's been so much of a backdrop. Do I feel optimistic, though, about where the future goes? Yes, because, again, speaking to Joy's, idea that the new generation are more, they're taking control of their future because the generations before them haven't. They're really stepping up to the mic. They have ideas, they have plans, they have resource capacities at their disposal to an extent, and they want to do better. And this is across the board. This is across all faith communities. And I see that in emerging young Australian Muslims who are very active, who are, whether it's for political office or within media, where they know change needs to be made, they recognize it, they see it. So there's this can-do attitude about flipping the script. And if they're not happy with the status quo, then engage where it matters. So yeah, there is acknowledgement that so much work has to be done, that you are constantly having to deal with being otherized and always be spoken about but not spoken to. So I think globally that acknowledgement of that happening means that you get creative and you start taking control of things into your own hands.
Tasneem, that's a great place to leave this conversation. We're going to have to wind it up. We've run out of time. To Tasneem Chopra, Rod Bauer, Venerable Zhu Shi, and Elhanan Miller, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation of race and religion. I guess the next step is politics, but that's for another week. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.